Another surprise, or actually, it's not really a surprise because this is what Donald Trump has said was going to happen, but firing his defense secretary, Mark Esper, Abby, and calling the whole situation, a termination, saying you're terminated. And I know he was no fan of Mark Esper, but interesting to see Mark Esper is now out, already replaced.
Yeah, just 2 days after Donald Trump was told that he's no longer going to have the job in about 2 months' time, he tweeted that he's going to fire the defense secretary, Mark Esper. And as you mentioned, their relationship is pretty strained. Mark Esper was aware of that. There were reports that he had a resignation letter signed and ready to go. He didn't get a chance, perhaps, to use it. But certainly since June, when Mark Esper publicly disagreed with Trump about sending an active duty military officers into American cities to quell peaceful protests, the relationship has continued to deepen in a divide, and they certainly weren't getting along very well. So he has announced a replacement. His name is Christopher Miller. Analysts are saying, he's sort of a junior person to lead the Pentagon. And certainly in this transition phase, as we move from Trump to Biden, people are saying this is probably not an ideal time to make drastic changes like this. But of course, as we know with Donald Trump, he doesn't usually follow routine procedure.
Abby, great to see you today, and thanks for talking to us and bringing us the very latest from Philadelphia. We'll talk again real soon.
Thanks, Todd.
Good afternoon. I'm Diane Macedo. We're coming on the air with breaking news right now. President Trump has apparently fired Defense Secretary Mark Esper. The president announced the news on Twitter, writing, "Esper has been terminated and will be replaced by Director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Christopher Miller, effective immediately." Now, many suspected Esper could be out after the election, after he publicly disagreed with the president back in June, saying active duty troops should not be sent to help control protests in American cities. For more on this, I'm joined on the phone by ABC News Chief Global Affairs Correspondent Martha Raddatz. Martha, thanks for jumping on the phone with us. What do we know right now about this change and why it happened?
Well, I think it was certainly expected over the long run, but I don't think it was expected the way it was today, just immediately. One of the first things President Trump has done after the election. But Esper did have, for many months, a letter of resignation ready to go because he feared he would be fired. I think more interesting, in a way, is who's coming in, and it's a man named Christopher Miller, who will be the acting Secretary of Defense, and he comes from the National Counterterrorism Center. He's director of the National Counterterrorism Center. Before that, he was an assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations. His background is in special operations. So we don't really know whether there's more to this, why President Trump would want to put in someone in that position from the Counterterrorism Center. There's been a lot of emphasis on Iran, as we know. Secretary Pompeo, the Secretary of State, wants to put more sanctions on Iran, more and more and more, leading up to January 20th.
And Martha, there had been some tension between President Trump and Secretary Esper since that controversial photo op outside Lafayette Park during protests back in June. Law enforcement had to disperse the crowd of protesters so the president could take that photo outside St. John's Church with the Bible. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs apologized for his role in that event, and Esper claimed that he didn't know what was going to happen. He also was heavily criticized for urging governors to, quote, dominate the battle space when dealing with protesters, a comment he has apologized for. So how much tension did all of that put between the White House and the Defense Department, and how much do you think that factors into all of this?
Well, as we know, President Trump doesn't like anybody pushing back on him, and certainly not publicly. So he was not happy with that. He was not happy with Esper's comments after that, saying he did not want to federalize the National Guard, and he was not happy with General Milley. Both Esper and Milley say they did not realize what was happening in terms of that photo op. Chairman Milley actually got out of the way before the photo op, but both men regretted being anywhere near that, and they made that clear. General Milley apologized at the National Defense University a couple of weeks later, said the military should not be politicized.
And senior Pentagon reporter Louis Martinez is also on with us now. Louis, how's the Pentagon reacting to this?
Well, Diane, I can tell you that the Pentagon is reacting very quickly and very quietly for now. There's been no response from the Pentagon officially, but I can tell you that as I came in, preparations were already underway for Esper's successor to come into the building. That's Chris Miller. He's the head of the National Counterterrorism Center, and arrangements were made for his motorcade to come into the front steps of the Pentagon. Now, I don't know whether Esper is the one who's going to be out there to greet him shortly, but you can tell that things are happening fairly quickly. Now, who is Chris Miller? Chris Miller just left the Pentagon 2 years ago. He's a former active duty Army soldier and reservist who then went on to head the office here at the Pentagon that is plans against counterterrorism operations. So special operations and counterterrorism, that's what he did here at the Pentagon for 2 years, and then he shifted over to the National Counterterrorism Terror Center. So he knows the building, and so he's going to be a familiar face for some. But again, let's remember, we're talking about 2.5 months here that he's going to be the acting Secretary of Defense at a key time during this transition when you're going to have presumably Biden administration officials wanting to come in here to get read in on what they need to know when they take over, because when the new president is sworn in on January 20th, the entire government shifts over as well to the administration, and they don't want to have any gaps in national security.
All right, we are just getting word right now in the middle of a market rally that the president has just fired Mike Esper as defense secretary. He announced that via tweet. I don't know if he told the secretary he was fired via tweet. Nevertheless, we already had gotten word that the defense secretary felt that he might be on borrowed time here, especially when, he was saying at the time, the president back in the summer using active duty troops to sort of stall these large-scale protests across the U.S. Remember, right after the death of George Floyd, that criticism still stuck with the president, said that military forces should be used in a law enforcement role and only a law enforcement role. So he was not supportive of what the president had done at the time. President clearly never got over that, and win or lose when the final votes are in. Of course, the president, not much a fan of the media sort of glomming onto the notion that Joe Biden is the president-elect. He is, but the fact of the matter is that he would not wait until then to get rid of his defense secretary. He's out right now. Blake Berman with more on this just developing story. Blake, I believe that the defense secretary had even, telegraphed that he could be fired via tweet. Indeed, that happened, but can you fill us in on the details?
Yeah, I'm glad you note that, Neil, because remember, Jim Mattis, the one-time defense secretary, too, there was a back and forth as to whether or not he resigned or he was fired. John Bolton, the former national security advisor, whether or not he resigned or if he was fired. There was some reporting out there that that Mark Esper, the defense secretary, was gearing up for a resignation. There were other reports that the president was gearing up to fire him. Now we see this tweet from the president that he has been terminated, so we'll have to sort of make some calls and try to figure out here whether or not he was terminated or resigned. In any event, one thing that I think should be noted here, Neil, is that Mark Esper is also at the very, very top of one of the people running Operation Warp Speed.